the final phase of Urban October. We are happy to have you all here to discuss an untapped urban resource called urban values. This will be an informal kind of a discussion where we'll have three panelists, speakers, then Adam Vaughan, Reza Purvaziri, and Julie Ward will be speakers, who will be then followed by panelists Derek Giberson, Eugene Vandenberg, Dekar Noor. Then there'll be two main themes that the speakers will address, which will be then discussed by the panelists. The question one is, what is the concept of urban values and how do we develop it in cities? What is the interaction with urban economy? Then that will be followed by the discussion after the speakers provide their views. Then we will have the second question, how can we create interaction with society about urban values to promote public participation? So these are the days when we discuss value chains of goods and services. But it's time that we reflect, as the executive director says, in these times, that the question of values. Because historically, cities have played a key role in creation of values. Cities and not nations have also been the source of wealth. It's well known that famous Jane Jacobs, you all know, described in the classic works, the interrelation of cities, values, and wealth. Towns and cities change. In the 20th century, they derived their right to exist from production of goods and services. Then this century, we're talking about creative and recreational economy to safeguard the development and prosperity of cities. This is not enough. Soon, cities will be deemed to be a success when they are capable of coping with climate change, migration, data revolution, and an energy transition as well. So what we're talking about is making cities livable and sustainable needs a much broader approach than making a grand design or implementing environmental policies. The values of livable and sustainable cities are closely related to values of an inclusive and competitive city. One of the lessons that can be learned from the past is that successful towns are not only capable of repeatedly adapting to new functions and identities, but they're also good at combining and including old and new values, functions, and identities. So values are principles of behavior. Values include everything that gives directions and actions. In contemporary philosophy, as you know, this includes thinking, seeing, feeling, and acting. So of course, it's not easy to discuss values, especially in the urban context. If you ask an individual about her or his values, they might feel even invaded. So, what conditions are favorable for the process of value creation? What we need is dialogue, diversity, involvement, responsibility, cohesion, compassion, and empathy. There are many cities in the world that are based on values and discussion of values, like Bilbao in Spain. The core values aims to generate a space for analysis, dialogue, reflection, and collaborative work. Even the city of Cambridge in Canada is committed to values of integrity, respect, inclusiveness, and service. So with that, I would request Honorable Adam Vaughan to start the discussion with his wise remarks on values and cities. Here you are, Adam Vaughan.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about cities any day of the year, let alone on World Cities Day. As someone whose life is revolved around how we build, how we create, and how we share cities. It's as I often say, it's always a good day when you can talk about urban affairs, and I'm happy to join such an esteemed crowd to do so. During COVID, one of the things we've seen in the community that I come from, Toronto, is a significant increase in the number of encampments in city parks as people without shelter, homeless individuals, folks who have been projected from housing systems or who have had to flee domestic situations which aren't safe. we have seen tents spring up. We think close to 1,500 people are currently camping in city parks, and right across the country, the number is probably closer to 5,000 when we include places like Vancouver in particular, Victoria, and some of the more hospitable climates that we find in our country. It's not always possible to do this. What's fascinating is when you go through those parks and you talk to the individuals that are there, they are actually building little tiny cities inside of cities. And in fact, a friend of mine who's a writer once said that big cities are the only place you can go now to find a real small town. But what's fascinating about these little clusters of people is that they actually are cities in so many ways. You see people with common addictions, people with similar mental health challenges, people who want privacy cluster in different ways, and you can literally, as an urban planner, look at it and see the formation of a city. But what's interesting, and one of the things that COVID has shown us, is that those with the fewest resources, well, they instinctively form collectives to support each other. The more impoverished you are, the more marginalized you are, whether it's through conditions that you've chosen or conditions which are just your natural state. But the poorer you are in a city, they're further away from good services you are. So while they cluster in parks, they don't cluster it with access to clean water. They don't have sanitary conditions which are helpful. They're not looked upon by their neighbors as good neighbors, and they certainly aren't tolerated very easily. And the human rights certainly aren't respected when it comes to cities trying to, or local governments clearing these people out. These are the beginnings of what we would see in other parts of the world as things called shanty towns or poblaciones, or some of the more informal settlements we see clustered around cities. What it tells us is a couple of things. One of the great human impulses is to create settlements and to create economic systems and to create collective capacity in a geographical way. The other thing it shows us, however, is that there is a very competitive edge to cities that see those who are most successful hoard, and those who are least successful effectively are preyed upon. And COVID has shown this in ways that are quite frankly lethal. We know that poverty is the most powerful force and form of violence on the planet, and we can see it when it marries up with an epidemic, the impact it has. And so I think one of the things we have to start to do as urban leaders is actually learn from the natural instincts of those who have very few resources and look at how they marshal resources, and then find ways to build strength into those communities as opposed to break them up and try to restore some sort of natural order from above. So when I look at these parks and you look at these circumstances, and when we try to move people into safer places, because quite frankly, it's not safe to stay in these parks, we have to take a look at the social structures that are being created and move people to safety. The same can be said of low-income neighborhoods. The same can be said of migrant communities that cluster in cities. We have to find ways to both build with that natural instinct for collective action, but we also have to bring the best thinking to make it as safe as possible, as healthy as possible, and as prosperous as possible for everybody. And this, in fact, is the art of city building. But we often think of city building as something which developers do, or something which governments do, or something which powerful economic forces do. The reality is it's the natural instinct of people to collectivize. It's the natural instinct of people to share. It's the natural instinct of people to take care of each other. And if we can start to, as cities, learn from those communities that are informal and formalize their processes with better science, with better economic investments, with better social structures, we can build healthier cities from the ground up. And that's the sustainable way to construct cities. And so when we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, and when we look at human settlement, and when we look at the impact that the current pandemic is having, it gives it's a hard time to be optimistic, but there is some optimism there. And I think the optimism there is to lean into the topics of discussion today. What is the culture of our cities? What is the culture of all of the communities in our cities? And how do we take that culture and turn it into a civic purpose so that it's a shared purpose? But also, how do we turn the informal economy and the informal settlements into established neighborhoods with protected practices and with the ability for the talents and wealths and opportunities within those communities to really be brought to full advantage. And I think that's the challenge in front of us. How do we take the poblaciones and the shanty towns and look at their structure, look at their organic capacities, look at their internal economies, and develop them, in a co-developed way, but by making sure that people with lived experience are at the center of what we're trying to do. When we do that, and when we work that way, you can start to see some very positive results. Right next door to one of the largest encampments is probably the poorest neighborhood in the riding that I represent. But it's a neighborhood with a great deal of focus on scholarship. A lot of immigrant families there, but a lot of multi-generational families there, including some of the oldest African Canadian families in the country. They turned themselves into a co-op because they saw the housing community that they were told to live in as being something which had no internal economy. They always hired people from the outside to do work in the neighborhood, and then they left with the wealth. The community turned itself into a co-op, convinced the government that it could run itself, and now has the highest rate of attendance in post-secondary institutions. It's revitalization, it's reimagining itself right now and rebuilding itself. And there are 680 families and close to 70 young people have acquired skilled trades through an apprenticeship program as part of the revitalization. They are dreaming a new community center, but that community center is based on food security. They have additionally changed the way public housing is looked at, and they actually have built in 25,000 square feet of nonprofit commercial space that they can then create their own economy for. So they're lifting themselves up because we listened to them, and because they had a vision, and because when they didn't have the skill sets they needed, they sent their kids off to school to get those skill sets. This kind of ground up development is the art of city building, but it's not normally seen that way by local government or by national governments. We often measure our success based on GDP or the number of cranes in the sky or the number of jobs or the size and population of the city. But the reality is that when we lean into these communities that are self-organized and we let them blossom, our urban spaces become safer, better, and healthier. And more importantly in all of that, the kids do better. And if the kids start doing better, they pull the whole country, the whole community, the whole region with them. And so there are some great lessons to be learned, but it starts by understanding the natural inclination people have to be collective. And I'll leave you with one last thought before I conclude. I think that cities are one of the places where there's always an extra seat at the table. I've never been to a dinner party in a city where a fifth or sixth unexpected guest shows up and you kick out, the grandmother at the end of the table because she's the weakest. Cities are a place where there's always an extra chair and there's always a way to lean into our capacity to share. And I think that capacity to share is part of what this conversation is about today, as we share experiences across national borders on our urban fabrics. But I think the other thing that's really critical here is that our capacity to learn from each other is something which cities have an inherent talent from as well. So I look forward to the discussion, even though I will have to run off to the House of Commons because I'm on House duty today and I couldn't get out. It's a minority parliament. But I think that those thoughts are part of what we talk about when we talk about the culture of cities. And I think also they're part of what we talk about when we talk about the opportunities cities have to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. With that, I'll hand it back to the chair.
Thank you, Honorable Vaughan. Very powerful message, discussing the need for building on natural instinct for collective action. Is the basis of our existence it is. And as you say, end up by saying that if there's enough room in your heart, there's always a room by the table. So these, I think, where we build our solidarity in making cities livable and a city that's for all. And the cooperative housing model of 680 families is absolutely fascinating, how we can regenerate a city or a part of the city. Amazing indeed. I hope you could stay with us for the rest of the session. I understand that you will have to leave us, but I hope that you can continue whenever you can during the course of this meeting, which is an hour to start with. Thank you once again. I will now request Reza Purvaziri to share his remarks. Reza, as you all know, he's the chair of Urban Economy Forum and co-chair of Urban Economy Forum 2020 as well. He has been, and he's an architect, and he has been quite active in making cities livable, both architecturally and value-wise. And he was designated as the first global advocate of UN Habitat from 2016 to 2019. He doesn't need much more introduction. You all know him. And our dear Reza, here you are to talk about values and urbanization.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for such an important meeting. I believe still we need to enrich this conversation together. And I believe based on the structure of Urban Economy Forum, we try to create different group of people come together to talk about these important issues. And I believe the concept of urban values is really aligned with our goals about establishment of Urban Economy Forum. Based on a speech of Secretary General on 2015, when during presenting sustainable development goals, there is a kind of emphasis about role of cities to realize all the goals, not only goals number 11. All the goals need to realize and focus by city leaders, mayors, and cities in general, because there is a kind of belief that the cities is the most complex place and the most important place to present different dimension of the settlement, and it's completely related to our lifestyle. It's a kind of foundation of all the interaction with the society. That's why we need to focus about that. And in the other hand, lots of values and resources comes from cities. Lots of developers, different stakeholders try to make some benefit for themselves during based on the kind of interaction with cities, and they are trying to generate money from cities. And in this diagram, municipality try to have some direct interaction with them to try to get some public benefit based on that structure. I believe the concept of urban economy is really close to the urban values. Still, there are lots of different categories not recognized by official city leaders as urban resources. There is lots of kind of wide area for urban resources not recognizable for city leaders. Some of the private sector people try to investigate and try to explore this such important opportunity based on media technology. Some of them raise up and have some interaction with society, and we can see based on that lots of income generated and create some prosperity in the economic level. And but still lots of gap in this regard. I believe this dialogue have to be enriched between city leaders. Based on my experience with city leaders during 2 decades, there is a kind of official way for thinking about urban economy, municipal finance in the municipality. Case by case is different. In different countries have different understanding, but in general, there is a routine, but it's not very focused about, in general, city leaders have not any focus about recognizing urban resources and urban values in the cities. If we are able to think about that, create that dialogue, which kind of urban resources still it's untapped. I believe we are able to create a kind of a specific dialogue with the with the society, and we will increase the concept of public participation that is so important for the future of cities. Uh, and I believe city leaders need to rethink about urban values, especially about civilization, cultural heritage, different values, even environment. There is lots of urban resources not recognizable by the official system of municipality, and we need to focus about that and bring them up and raise them, elevate that one in front of the municipality to think about that, not only for generating income, but also for involvement more people to have kind of feeling they are belong to city, they are working in city and for city. And that's the kind of different, I believe, dialogue we need to enrich. We are trying to enrich the dialogue during the Urban Economy Forum, try to bring different voices and create kind of different vision about urban resources. Urban resources is I believe, is core of this discussion. We need to think about urban resources. Still lots of room we have about thinking, working, research about urban resources. And still we need to encourage people to come and participate and generate some values based on the opportunities of cities. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Reza, for this inspiring comments and your thoughts. Of course, urban resources are both tangible and intangible, as you say, and city leaders need to really rethink about urban values, and it's a process that needs to be going on with discussions as this that we are having. So then the question is, what the concept of urban values that you mentioned here, and how do we develop it in cities, and what's the interaction with the urban economy, as you mentioned, how developers indeed can interact with cities and citizens in that context. With that, with these comments in mind, may I then request Julie Ward to present her remarks. Julie has been an active participant, supporter, and has been a leader of the Urban Economy Forum since its inception. She was also a Labour member of the European Parliament, and she has been championing the rights of children and youth. She co-founded a Parliament cross-party, cross-committee intergroup on children's rights, and she has been the Urban Economy Forum Steering Committee co-chair. And he's a great believer in bringing urban values in practice by espousing the idea of equality among people, irrespective of gender, race, creed, class, or culture. Here you are, Julie.
Thank you very much, Krishnan. It's really great to be here again. And what a fantastic theme for us to reflect on. So I've been giving this some thought, and of course, I think that urban values should reflect the values of all those who inhabit the city, those living and working in the city, including transient populations, but also commuters, traders, tourists, the people who use the city as a place for leisure. And in fact, our tangible and intangible heritage of urban life reflects this through time. So if you look at the names of streets, squares, parks, buildings, even shopping malls, they tell the story of urban values in the cities that we inhabit. And often we're not always looking at that. It becomes over familiar to us. For example, the city of Nottingham in the UK is famous for its lace. It still has a lace market, even though it doesn't have a lace industry anymore, although it has a textile industry. And it is, in fact, Huguenot refugees who I am descended from, who came to Nottingham with their lace making skills and founded the wealth of that city. And it still exists within the fabric of the city because there is a lace market. And I think that if we all looked a bit more closely at the cities that we live in, we would see the imprint of these of the values, the communities, the things that identify these communities and what they brought to our cities. We would see these things much more clearly. We've got a really important job to do to revisit this as society progresses, particularly in the light of Black Lives Matter. And the city of Bristol in the UK made international news when the statue of the slave trader Edward Colston was toppled by huge crowds and dragged and pushed into the harbour. But if you're in Bristol, the name Colston would have been synonymous with the city. There was the main hall that was receiving all the big bands and theatre, touring theatre companies and big extravaganzas was called Colston Hall. And I say was because the city has already realised that this difficult past has to be dealt with because it doesn't reflect the man who made his fortune trading in sugar, owning slave plantations, owning sugar plantations and trading in slaves, which gave him the wealth with which to build that city. Those values don't sit very well with our multicultural communities now. I think what we've found is that inequality has often prevailed, whereby the values of the top echelons in society take precedence. So those with economic power, like Edward Colston, for example, and those with political power also. In fact, the street that I live in is called Gladstone, and there are many streets and buildings named after different prime ministers, different kings and queens, whether or not they were good people or not. But I think that says something about how our urban environments have been operating. So those with economic power, political power, and those with capital. And more that's happening in terms of our sports stadiums. So many now of our football teams, which have existed for years and years and years, maybe 100 years or so, are now being named after large corporations or in fact emirates, so which is, I think, a bit strange actually. And in Newcastle City, which is not far from where I live, there was a huge uproar about the renaming of the stadium there, because a fan base, it's a very visceral thing, loving sport and being a fan, and suddenly somebody giving your club a different identity can be a real problem. And what we found is that this inequality has resulted in slums, ghettos, no-go areas on one hand, and then gated communities of comparative wealth on the other. And we have to shift the focus towards a holistic, needs-based approach that takes account of all sections of society. And I think that we need to blur the edges between those communities. We need to make them more porous. We need to encourage interaction between different neighborhoods. And to remember that diverse, opening and welcoming societies are actually the most economically successful. And we can even look to history and heritage to see where that there were models in the past. So, for example, the Quakers, who were entrepreneurs, who were business people, when they built their towns and cities and their factories and the communities for their workers to live in, built also hospitals and schools and parks, often all kinds of facilities that people could use. So yes, they didn't build pubs, interestingly enough. So the town of Darlington, which is also here in the northeast of England, has a whole area of very beautiful architecture and not a single pub. But I suppose I wanted to make the point that, you know, there were some, it is possible to be an entrepreneur and still to think about how you can create an inclusive community. Saltaire Mills in Yorkshire is another wonderful place. You know, these model towns where people were thinking about the well-being. You know, libraries too. Libraries were often endowments. So urban values could and should include hubs of welcome. And I've been at a conference on cultural diplomacy for 4 days, and somebody introduced this wonderful concept of virtue hospitality. And I'd like to introduce that now. I'd like to share that that idea, you know, that to be open and welcoming, to espouse and embody that virtue is really important. And so we should be encouraging all our cities, all our urban centres to take that on. In the UK, we've got a wonderful programme called Cities of Sanctuary, which was a way for cities to brand themselves as places of welcome for refugees and people who are fleeing violence and conflict. And that has been a wonderful programme that has enabled communities to open their facilities, open their hearts as well to new residents. Neighborliness is very, very important, you know, and sometimes in the poorest communities, neighborliness was most evident. So I'm living in an ex-coal mining area, and people, you know, wouldn't even have 2 halfpennies to rub together, but they'd still give you, you know, the shirt off their back or their last morsel of food. And I think that wonderful way of being neighborly with each other, looking out for each other, is something that we must encourage. And solidarity between generations, between faiths, between ethnicities, finding the common ground between all of us is really important. But we also need to create greenhouses of entrepreneurship. And I think cities have always been places where, you know, that's quite possible because there's there's a concentration of minds, of people, of ideas, and there's often lots of problems that need to be solved and people there with ideas. But urban values should embody that and should create the growing conditions for those ideas too. I think wells of opportunity, we need to be very cognizant about wells of opportunity. So broadening out that culture of openness to innovation and collaboration, for new ideas, experimentation, labs, and these kinds of things can happen, you know, in areas where the industry is gone. So in the old docks, you know, where ships don't come anymore, in the old mills that aren't producing lace or you know, or cotton goods anymore, but these buildings still exist, and they're fantastic spaces for laboratories. And as somebody who worked in the cultural sector before I worked in politics, I have to say that it's often artists who enliven these spaces in the most wonderful ways. And we really, the pandemic has completely decimated the creative and cultural sector, and this is a great opportunity now to say let's open up those spaces for these really creative, imaginative ideas. And then maybe finally, just to talk about the value of exchange. Urban centres have always been places for exchange. So markets, you know, I talked about the lace market, but pretty much every town, city has markets. And that's a very obvious form of exchange in terms of goods that people will bring, and be able then to make a living, to go back and invest more in their small holding or in their cottage industry or whatever. But we also ought to expand that so that we are trading in ideas and values as well as in food and fabric and goods. Okay, and I'm going to finish there.
Thank you so much, Julie. I mean, one thing that actually, one point you raised very importantly is values are not neutral. So we have to be, able to be sort of, brave enough to get rid of the belief systems where angels fear to tread, as they say, of the past. So I think that's where I think the values sort of keep, sort of renewing itself. Those good and bad values important to take care of, as you said, solidarity, and values that actually take care of people and take care of each other, including using things like culture, trade, art, and good neighborliness. So as we have had very three inspiring and thought-provoking speakers, now I would like to leave the floor open to panelists, three of them, and taking time into consideration. We have one more question to be addressed by speakers after the panelists have expressed their view. I suggest that panelists use, say, for example, 3 to 4 minutes to comment on the speakers, and then we can move on to the second question to the speakers. So panelists are, to start with, may I request Derek Giberson, who is a councillor of City of Oshawa, and he has been advocating alternative financing mechanism to empower communities to see that financially how they can be more self-reliant by the discussions that I've had with him. So it's important that how he sees the remarks and speeches by the three speakers, and how would you react to those comments that you have heard, Derek? Here you are.
Thank you, Krishnan, and good morning, everyone. Great to see you all. So very quickly, I'll dive in here. There are a lot of comments that I've already heard that are that resonate very strongly here in our city in Oshawa. When Adam provided his opening remarks, he spoke about the homeless encampments in the city of Toronto, and one of the things that I've had to do as someone who is an advocate, in when I put my other hats on, or I guess they're sort of blurred hats as a city councillor, but also involved in the housing sector, involved in urban poverty responses in our city. One of the first things I have to do for people who are dealing with the shock of seeing encampments and people living in tents in our city, which historically was not normal, is to first let them know that this is something that's not unique to Oshawa. We're experiencing it in cities all across our country. Likewise with the opioid crisis. Now with the pandemic, you compound those issues, and it's forced some very difficult conversations into the public sphere that we were avoiding before. They existed previously, but I think that this comes back to the discussion on urban values. And I really appreciated hearing these thoughts about taking the culture of a city and turning that into civic purpose. How do we have that discussion and find shared purpose through that, as Adam mentioned. Reza, you also brought up the thought about urban resources that are maybe not recognized or untapped, and we see that substantially in marginalized communities. Like with Julie, my background is in the cultural sector. Prior to politics, I worked in the Canadian music industry, and the cultural sector is often an untapped resource in cities, and even more so if you come out into cities. So some of the outlying cities in countries like Canada, where suburban sprawl tends to be the norm. So Oshawa is a city that is a blend of urban and suburban, with some rural in the north end. We find that these questions of participation and urban values don't get spoken about quite as much. I think the robust conversations that happen in some of the truly urban, densely urbanized cities, that conversation is still waking up in some of the secondary cities, the outlying communities that tend to have that suburban design. And, you know, I think that we really need to start looking at how city design impacts these types of dialogues and these types of conversations, this type of interaction. Um, you know, Julie had referenced gated communities versus low-income neighborhoods. And, you know, I really appreciated, Julie, hearing you say that we need to blur the edges between those communities. The evidence is there that economically diverse communities are the most successful. I'm a very big proponent of changing our language away from affordable housing to equitable housing, because our neighborhoods really, you know, we shouldn't be ghettoizing people. And, you know, I do believe that's the direction things are taking here in Canada, but we need to really accelerate that dialogue. So, you know, I'm very appreciative of what, you know, what we've heard so far today. I'm not going to take up too much more time because I was told I have about 3 or 4 minutes. But those are certainly thoughts that have resonated with me as a city councillor, and the ward I represent is right in the downtown. It is the most urban part of the entire Durham region, which is east of Toronto. So these questions are certainly very, very pertinent for myself as a city politician.
Thank you very much, Derek, for briefly commenting on the speakers and emphasizing the role of culture as a kind of what's a glue that can keep urban economy and society in its way forward. May I then request Eugene Vandenberg, who has also been associated with the Urban Economy Forum for years since its inception. And he's a finance executive and is expert on finance. And he speaks sometimes languages that I don't understand because it's very technical and finance oriented times. So it's important for us to listen from him, how he looks at the whole question of values. Values are not only about value chains, it's a value loaded question maybe in a way that relating to cities. Eugene, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And morning and good afternoon and good evening to all the participants. I must say the speakers have really come forward with some striking comments. I was sitting here and I was wondering what on earth am I going to be saying, because I'm a financial kind of guy. And then it started dawning onto me that, you know, what we're really talking here about is the Maslow hierarchy of needs. And if we look at the two most basic levels, safety, security, food, water, warmth, and rest, that's really what we are talking about here today. It's almost like we've lost the neighborly capability from years gone by. I can remember in the 70s, as a little boy growing up, people will spend hours visiting one another on weekends in the form of garage parties. You would actually have a party in your garage and the whole neighborhood would come together. We've lost that. And from a value perspective, it's really important to understand what those core values are, first and foremost. I think we as experts in different fields sometimes get so carried away with the efficiency that we want to create. And then the solutions that need to be found are really trying to address the problems that are right in front of our eyes. I also had a flashback. If you watch and if you like Western movies, how the old town started up. It was just a bunch of people that came together and uniquely found that value that makes them a unity. If you think about the animal kingdom, very similar. A pack of lions, there's just this natural habitat that they create that's driven by their values. And we as people have really lost some of that over the years. And I just want to add to the aspect of contrast here. Having grown up in South Africa under apartheid was not a nice experience. To this day, there is huge divide between the rich and the poor. It's what Julie was saying. The rich live in gated communities and the poor living in slums and informal settlements. And those people really struggle. So the question is, and the company that I was involved with, we've done a lot of work to reduce poverty, to help create better housing, to help improve the living standards, creating jobs, all those good things, but it's still not enough. And unfortunately, the evil that's eating into that is corruption. It's 26 years since South Africa transitioned to a real true democracy, but the line between rich and poor is still very, 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 very evident. And corruption, unfortunately, played a huge role that didn't succeed in uplifting people out of poverty. I was also fortunate enough to do a lot of economic empowerment work. The group that I was associated with, they didn't wait for the government. They just started doing things. And they raised capital, and then the returns that they raised from those successful community-driven projects, they invested right back into those very same communities in creating local clinical facilities, schools, helping people to come together to produce food on a local basis. That's what we probably need to think about when we talk about reducing poverty. And unfortunately, COVID-19, we're only in the beginning phases of COVID-19 now. We don't know what the impact is going to be. I'm actually very shocked to learn that in Canada, there are roughly about 5,000 people living in tents in parks. It's kind of like, wow, it's unheard of. But then also you hear in Canada, a developed nation, where there are still water boiling advisories out in certain communities. And as a new naturalized Canadian, you think, how is that possible? This is a developed country. And yet there's definitely some poverty in the undertone. And I think if you think about how the Maslow hierarchy of needs relate to the UN developmental goals, I think there's a strong message there. I really enjoyed listening to the speakers. I would say that we probably need to pause and when we do city and urban development, pay attention and think about what are the undercurrent tones driving the value in our cities. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very, very, very important point you brought about the Maslow hierarchy of needs and the question of corruption. Of course, corruption may create values for the individuals who are corrupt, but not necessarily the value for the society. That I think it's important that we take these factors into consideration in talking about values and solidarity. So when we have Dekha Noor, we have been talking about, I had a comment saying that we must think about the community role and role of youth, as Fazil has mentioned in the discussion remarks. So as you know, Dekha has been an activist in the social economic policy that impact on people. So her main focus is social innovation. That's kind of her passion, she says. So may I then request Dekha to provide comments on the speakers, and we have about 5 minutes so that we can go over to the next question after your comments, Dekha. Here you are.
Okay. Good morning. Can you hear me?
Good morning.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Hello, everyone. As you said, most of my work in Toronto is usually focusing on social development. I am a big believer of that if we focus on human development before any development, I think we will succeed and reach our goal as a society. First, I want to say in this special occasion of World City Day, and the values of urban values is something that's very close to my heart. Living and moving in different spaces across the city of Toronto, especially advocating and working with the city of Toronto housing, part of the Tenant First Advisory Panel for the city of Toronto, and also working on a different developments, whether it's economic, community development, community capacity building. I want to say thanks to all the speakers. They were all amazing. What you said, it really addresses the urban values. If I want to touch on what Adam said, was the the issues that our city is still facing when it comes to housing, and the homelessness that we're still trying to overcome. And with COVID-19, we've seen what the gap that is increasing. And I think that is really something that I really enjoy listening, and so that it's been addressed until we reach the city, the city that we all want. And also, Julia, I really like when you focused on the issues, the social issues that we're facing right now, and how we need to make sure that everybody is included, because the city is for everyone. And to create cities that are just not for the people that live in the city, but also welcoming outside people that come into our cities, and have a space for them. And also Raza explained the importance of precipitation, importance of unity, importance of working together. And I think we will never achieve anything if we don't work together. It is so crucial as a social developer that precipitation of our every industry, every politician, every community, grassroots. When I speak like this, I am someone who came from grassroots, so you can understand the passion that I have, that we put human development. Everything we build, everything we create should be tailoring to either individual or communities. If we create anything, but it's not benefiting human beings, then we all can understand how wasted that if development or that resource is. So I think I don't want to take a lot of time, but there are a lot of work that needs to be done. And I think with COVID-19, we've seen things that were under the rack that came out. So a lot of people say that, why is this happening now? Where it just catched up with us. And I just want to quickly touch on youth. Someone who's at York University now, working with a lot of the youth, we've seen what happened to like the gap of equity. When you have a young 21-year-old who, because they're due to COVID-19, they have to go home. But then we see these things where, for example, some young people don't have the accessibility to continue 2020 university of school year. So, I mean, we need to address these things. We've seen some of our young, the younger youth live with families, but there are youth who don't have family. They're 21-year-old. They came to universities, and now they're told to leave the dorm rooms, go out there and quarantine. But what are they facing? They have no family. Now, coming to university was their hope of getting away poverty, getting away from homelessness. And now they're told to go because the universities are closed. There are thousands of them out there that have to share or sleep on a friend's couch. So going back, we need to just focus a lot of things and tailoring to the individual need without putting everybody in a box, because everybody does not get the same equity that we want people to get. Safety is so important. We've seen the rise of mental health, and because of COVID-19, it just even made it more worse. So when we talk about our healthcare, because when we talk about economy, our healthcare is part of it. Housing is part of it. So I don't want to go on, but I think moving forward, we want to see a cities that not only welcomes not only increases precipitation of our residents, not only make sure that there is equity in terms of housing and social development and economic development, but also a city that shows empathy, a city that takes care of those who desperately need to be part of, because I am in an okay place right now. 10 years ago, maybe not. 10 years from now, I don't know. So I think we need to all have that moving forward and creating these beautiful cities for everyone. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Deka. That was very, very useful to hear the real situation that young people are facing today in times of crisis like this, and where do value systems come into place. As we all know now, it is about 10:04. Our time limit was set 10:15. So we have one more question to discuss. So I don't know if I could ask your indulgence in extending this meeting by another 10-15 minutes. I don't know how is the general consensus here, or I understand that Honorable Adam Vaughan is not available for the next question to be discussed. So because
I've got a bit of time, so I'm here for a bit.
Okay. Oh, wonderful. Thanks a lot then. So we move on to the next question, is that, what is the concept and how can we create interaction with society about urban values to promote public participation? Because as you heard from the Executive Director of UN Habitat, she talked about transformational change. So transformation should be systemic. Transformation is long-term and sustained, and transformation disrupts existing order. So if you want to transform our society by fulfilling the Sustainable Development Goals in leaving no one behind, if you would have read the SDG agenda, there are about there are 6 times in the declaration they're talking about leaving no one behind. It means we're engaging and motivating people in what the 17 goals are supposed to be talking about. Of the 17 goals, the 17th is about partnership, that is participation, as Reza was mentioning in his initial remark. So SDGs cannot be achieved without significant public awareness and engagement, but it's not enough thinking about innovative ways of promoting citizen participation. But we need to see how do we do it actually. The traditional institutions of formal democracy, it's a question actually. Is it any longer sufficient to guarantee civil society's rights to participation? Indeed, we need to broaden public participation in the process beyond relatively few NGOs or CSOs, as well as the wider set of civil society actors, people, including communities from the indigenous communities, as well as communities who are left out from this discussion, whose voices are not being heard. That's a public participation, an important question. May I then request Honorable Adam Vaughan to come with his useful and inspiring remarks again, please. Here you are.
I've never liked the phrase "no one left behind." It implies that some people have agency in their lives to move forward and to choose direction and to leave a situation, while other people are literally chained to circumstance. And I've always found that phraseology to be extraordinarily hierarchical, and there's so much class structure implied in it that I think it is. It's out of place in the SDG sort of conception. I really find it disturbing. I think that one of the great challenges we have as we try to make our way in a world that is changing so quickly, whether it's through climate change or social upheaval or the pandemic we're currently experiencing, is that it's fundamental that we learn how to decentralize power, and we learn how to not empower people, but recognize agency in their own lives and support that agency and support that self-direction. I think that's where the SDGs have to get to. And so when we talk about this in an urban context, it's changing taxpayer to citizen. It's changing those left behind or those marginalized as an exclusionary set of linguistic denominators. And we have to start to take a look at at where the imagination is and where the creativity lies and where the ingenuity lies. You know, a longtime mentor of mine once said that the culture of the poor always becomes the business of the rich. And I think that one of the most important things we can do in realizing the SDGs and in creating a more equitable society is to actually give that agency that is inherent in low-income communities and in communities that are struggling with multiple challenges that almost sort of gang up on people. The most resourceful, courageous, bravest, smartest, and inventive people are those that are stuck in a space where their creativity isn't given room to grow. And so I think that there are things that we have to start to do to change this. And I think urban centers have the capacity to do this if we lean into the power that emanates from people who are struggling, as opposed to sustaining systems that tend to them. So instead of funding charities, tax and reinvest resources into communities that have had their resources depleted. Instead of talking about how we create equitable outcomes, start with equitable investments and start with a basis of equity. And I think that we have to change the channel on so many different conversations. The neighborhood I spoke about, Alexander Park, has a neighborhood just north of it, literally across the street, called Kensington Market, which is one of the most extraordinary neighborhoods, I would say, in North America. It is a middle-class neighborhood. Almost 150 years ago, when a recession and a pandemic hit just after the First World War, this middle-class neighborhood changed into a neighborhood of single-family homes, became rooming houses. Waves of post-World War I immigration to the city turned it into a multicultural community. And when the economy of the world stalled, it turned itself into a market. And it has thrived and been unique and dynamic ever since. It's the most dynamic neighborhood, I think, in Toronto. The lesson there is that when you give people freedom and agency, they create an economy and a way forward for themselves. And what's fascinating about this notion of the market is I defy you to name me a city that you were dropped into that city right now. If you were transported overnight and you landed in the city and you didn't know the language and you didn't have the currency and you had nothing, the one place you could go to figure out how to survive would be a market. And yet when we take a look at low-income communities right across North America, and when we take a look at modern planning around cities, and when we think about how we structure our economic circumstances, we build cities that force low-income communities into not having economy. We force them not to have power. We actually force them into not being taxpayers because they don't participate in the economic system in an equitable way. So I think one of the great challenges of this century and one of the great cultural values that cities can deliver to its citizens is this ability to make a go of it, to create that market, to create systems of trade, to create systems of sharing, to create systems of shared prosperity, to create systems of mutual support so that people move together, not one person being left behind and one person leaving. And I think this is one of the great challenges that's embraced by the SDGs. I think it's one of the missed opportunities of virtually every city I've had a chance to work in or experience, is that we don't understand how powerful that struggle of low-income communities is and how wonderful it can be in terms of solving challenges we have. So when we talk about the culture of cities and how we build that sense of citizenship and that sense of purpose in our communities, go straight to the areas where you think you have problems and find out what solutions those communities have built for themselves, and then find ways to reinforce it so that not a question of you not leaving them behind, but let them lead you to a better place. And I think that's one of the transformational opportunities that cities offer us. And when we celebrate that in our cities, the change that people can realize in their own lives becomes self-realized so that they don't leave themselves behind. And I think that's what's on offer for those of us who want to build better cities, as a way of getting to a fairer, stronger world.
Thank you so much. That's very useful and very inspiring indeed. As you said, yeah, market-based economies often do not take care of the market for the poor people. I mean, so that's where I think why cities have failed in being inclusive, and as the participatory approach is so important, and making SDGs a reality in that context indeed. So with that in mind, may I then request Reza, who already has touched upon the question of public participation, to forward his remarks, please, Reza.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I believe that the current model of urban leadership, it's not enough progressive for involve society. I believe we create a model of city leaderships for 5 decades ago, and still we can use that one based on lots of transformation that we had on the past, specifically past 2 decades. But still we are trying to use a kind of old-fashioned model of city leadership in our society. It's not enough progressive to involve people. It's not enough flexible to engage society, youth, women, to provide the kind of participation for them. And we have not enough urban data to think about the cities and what is the gap, what is the problems exactly. And even the urban values is I believe it's more progressive items that we need to rethink about a kind of a structure to bring this kind of dialogue in the municipality. In general, I'm not talking specifically about Canada, but in general, the model of urban management that we use, it's not good enough to involve society, and it's not good open enough open to say welcome to new idea, innovative, creativity, to change this paradigm. It seems we have some things to manage cities based on infrastructure and some basic requests, but in the other hand, the world of media in the contemporary world is progress, and we faced with kind of fundamental transformation. Still, we try to use the old-fashioned model of urban management to involve people, and then we talk about urban engagement, public participation. We need to restructure that model.
Thank you. Thank you, Reza. As you said, yesterday's solution is not useful for tomorrow's problems. That's where I think we need to create this dramatic change. In that context, then, may I request Julie to say, are we in need of an accountability revolution to sort of bridge the democracy deficit through enhanced public participation? You briefly mentioned about Black Lives Matter in your earlier remarks. That's kind of what public participation you're talking about. May I request Julie to come forward, please?
Yeah, well, I was already thinking about this important question about how to create this interaction that we know we ought to have, and that we'd be better off if we did have it. And I think we have to ask ourselves lots of questions. So who is setting the agenda? Who's framing the discussion? And are there opportunities for a wider group of stakeholders to actually create the priorities? Because if you ask, if you ask the homeless people in the park about their priorities, will be very different from the priorities, for example, of maybe a developer. So that's important. Who's asking who's asking the questions and setting the agenda? I also think there's an issue about exclusion through language. So often the world of urban planning is very, it's full of jargon and technical language, and that can be quite excluding. It can be confusing. It can actually sound very boring. And I think all of us who work in these fields, we know it's not boring. We know it's exciting. We know it's really, really vital. But sometimes I think we have to check our language, and we should maybe think about that a lot. So certainly, being a jargon buster in a public meeting, for example, so that if somebody uses acronyms very easily, we'd try and train people away from that. I think somebody already mentioned, I think it was Adam, about, who's not in the room. We have to be so sensitive when we look around at a group of people who we might be consulting with, and if we know our communities well, we should be recognizing who's not in the room, and we have to be very, very proactive about bringing in people who wouldn't normally come into those consultation spaces. People are experts of their own experiences. So, for example, the homeless are the most experienced at what it means not to have a home. The disabled are the most experienced about better access. So it's important that we recognise that. The City of Sanctuary movement that I was talking about earlier have a wonderful stream called Universities of Sanctuary and Sanctuary Scholars, and they talk about experts by experience, which I think should be much more something that we take on and promote. And do these interactions include the citizens of the future, the youngest people in our communities? And I believe we should be working with people, at nursery school, preschool. There are all kinds of really wonderful ways of engaging with even the smallest, tiniest children about how our cities could be better places for them, for their parents, for their teachers, for their grandparents. And children often have very exciting, innovative ideas, but they're often not listened to. So I don't just mean youth, I'm meaning really, really young children. And then are the authorities listening to the answers? Because we can have the best possible kind of wonderful, inclusive, participatory interaction, but if somebody isn't taking note of that, mapping it, and mapping the implementation and evaluating that, it's all for nothing. And I think particularly young people, they're not young very long, 18 and then you're an adult, and you might have made some wonderful suggestions at age 13, and 5 years later you still don't see the park that you suggested, created in your community, and people do begin to lose hope. So I think we've got to have that kind of pathway, and we really need transparency as well. And I think we need to give proper time and space to the participatory process. So that means, maybe making it take longer, maybe being open to that being a longer process, and removing the barriers to participation. And I'd like to suggest creative consultations. So, for example, using forum theatre, using open space, and real power in deciding where money is going. So participatory budgeting, which came, of course, from Brazil, which is it can be very empowering. And then just a few final points then. Having pride in one's endeavours is really, really important. And the old traditional guilds, this sense of belonging, could be revitalised. And also this sense of family. Maybe the city is a close-knit family which has to coexist even through disagreement. So how do we disagree? How do we talk to people that we don't agree with? We've still got to be able to do that. And then I was thinking about city fathers, but who are the city mothers? Okay, who are the city uncles and aunties, the city cousins, the sons and the daughters? And I include the adopted in that too. And I think that leaders have to be role models. They've got to model the kind of leadership that and the inclusion that they want everybody to take up, and that means gender balance. So I would always promote co-chairs, as you know, Krishnan.
Yes.
We need
Yes.
a man and a woman always
Yes,
as
I know.
co-chairs, but also like to suggest things like job shadowing as well, bringing
Okay.
people on board, okay, and including them, teaching them, training them, and listening at the same time. Thank you.
Very practical sessions indeed. Absolutely great. And so we are just running out of time. You know, we may be cut off by the electronic supervisors here. And so before we leave, we have two. I mean, the panelists maybe give one sentence comments maybe. Derek and Decca. Derek, do you have any comments on the panelists? Just the speakers just spoke.
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, I think some of the threads that were common, you know, that communities, communities don't get natural fabric, or communities that don't get their natural community fabric designed out of them will have greater public participation. But we also need to be looking at, identifying the specific policy area shifts and then being proactive in creating the space for public participation, not assuming that they're going to exist, but that it has to be embedded in our way of doing business as cities and, you know, as a city representative. One of the last things that Julie said that really stuck out was that if we're going to create time and space for that participatory process, it might take longer. We have to stop sacrificing, inclusivity for efficiency, and realize that sometimes things might be more efficient, but if they're less inclusive, the final outcome might not be an inclusive one. So, I think decentralizing power, as Adam mentioned, and as Reza also mentioned, that, you know, we really have to start being honest about the limitations of the old-fashioned model of urban engagement, because it's not working. So I'll leave with that.
Good intentions do not always lead to good outcomes all the time. Thank you. And then Decca, your final remarks, please.
Yes, I think everybody said exactly what I wanted to say, but thank you. But I just want to add saying that, especially most of my work here, I do it here in Toronto. And I think it's very important to me to always make sure that that everything that we're doing, like the outcome, always having that in our mind, the outcome, which is would this be the outcome that we wanna see? Would this be the outcome that we know it would be a beneficial to the individual that we're tailoring to? So I think creating again or developing anything that we're doing that we know it's not going to be the result or the outcome that we want. It's just waste of anybody who's working on that and anybody that we're trying to deliver that to. So the best way that as a cities we can just use our resources is always focus on the perspective of one's perspective. Right? What does one see? What does one want? So I think if we go into that, going into any work that we're doing, whether it's education, healthcare, the economy, development, housing, I think, and public participation in any work that I was part of, whether with Toronto Police, Toronto Housing, Social Development of Toronto, any work that we included citizens, the outcome was phenomenal. So I think we're moving into community policing, community development, community capacity building. I think as a social developer, I might have my own perspective, but what is the perspective of the individual that I'm delivering to? So I think as a cities, that should be the core of our value, is the individual, is the human development. And I know for sure if that is our core, I know we will succeed in any development, in any value for our city values. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. As you said, as Julie also mentioned, we're talking about a community collective perspective. That's what I think we need to be working towards. So we have come to the end of this very, very inspiring, informative, and sort of a reflective sessions that we had. And so, I mean, it's important that this discussion continues. The value discussion doesn't stop in an hour and a half. So it's kind of a continuous, this is an interesting process that Reza has set in motion, which I think we need to continue, work in Urban Economy Forum, future meetings, discussions, dialogues. I hope this can be repeated or this can be taken up again in a more elaborate manner when time permits. And so as a trivia, I might want to say the 29th of October, in 1787, Mozart had his first concert of Don Giovanni in Prague. So talking about culture, it's also interesting to note that, already, people have been engaging in these kind of things hundreds of years ago. So it's important that we promote the idea of culture, not only to deal with fine culture of art and music, as well as community culture participation and in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. If there isn't any final remarks from you, Reza?
So appreciate. Thank you so much.
Anybody else would like to comment before we leave? There's one second left. Would anyone like to say?
Yeah, it's one of, if you're
Yes.
looking around a room and you're saying who
Yes.
isn't in the room,
Yes.
you're already in the wrong room.
Uh-huh.
And this is part of that language about leaving no one behind.
Exactly. I think it's a
If
good
there's
point.
someone missing in the room, you're in the wrong room. And
Exactly.
I think that is what's critical about how cities are built, is that there's always a better place to be, and it's usually somewhere else. And I think that's part of what we have to do as leaders, is get everyone else in the right room. And when we do community work and community development work, in particular in as Dega talked about in Toronto community housing, if you're not in the living room of the person whose life you're trying to work with, you're in the wrong room. And I think that's something we should all take away from this conversation.
Amazing. This is very, very important.
Important. Yeah.
Yes.
If you don't mind, that what you just
Decca.
said was so powerful. Thank you so much, Adam. Like, that is exactly what I just kept saying. You're in the wrong room. You're using these resources in the wrong room. If you're not with the person, or you're supposed to the outcome where we want to see the outcome. So thank you so much for putting that in. I appreciate it.
So
And again, when we
reaching the
talk
whole
about
idea of leaving
Thank
no
you,
one
everyone.
behind. Yes.
when we talk
Thank you so
about
much indeed.
sustainability, we want that sustainability development to continue. So thank you so much. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Adam Vaughan. Thank you for sitting and sharing with with us your important points. We'll continue this work. Thank you again. Thank you, everybody. Have a nice
Thank you,
day.
everybody.
And
Thank you.
thank you, Sandy. Thank you. Thank you so much indeed.